Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The red moon hung ominously in the sky, casting its eerie glow over the quiet village. Darien stood before the shrine, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out to the stone altar. The air was still, yet charged with an ancient power, the kind that only emerged once in a generation when the red moon rose. It was a night of great significance, a night when oaths were sworn, and the gods themselves were said to bear witness. Darien, a seasoned warrior with the weight of years of battle etched into his face, felt the gravity of this moment as if it were a sword pressed against his throat. His people had always honored the red moon. It was their symbol of balance, the promise that no matter what trials they faced, they would rise again. Tonight, Darien would make his oath, just as his father had done before him and his father before that. But this night was different. The threat looming over their land was unlike any they had faced. The empire of Varian, ruthless and unstoppable, had cast its shadow across the continent, swallowing up villages and kingdoms alike. And now, it was Darien's homeland that lay in its path. His village was one of the last remaining free settlements, untouched by the Empire's cruel grip. For now, the thought weighed on him as he knelt before the shrine, his sword laid out before him, gleaming under the moonlight. His mind raced back to the countless battles he had fought, the blood spilled on fields far from here, and the comrades he had lost. He closed his eyes, trying to summon the strength he needed to make the vow he knew was expected of him. "I swear," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling of the trees. "I swear to protect my people, to defend this land, and to give my life if I must, so that we may remain free." The words felt like iron in his mouth, heavy and unyielding. But as they left his lips, something shifted inside him, a calm, a clarity that had been missing for months. The oath was binding now, not just to his people, but to the gods who watched from the red moon's glow. That he stood slowly, sheathing his sword. The night air was cold, biting at his skin, but he paid it no mind. His thoughts drifted to Elara. The name stung like a fresh wound, a reminder of what he had lost. She had been his everything, his love, his reason for surviving the horrors of war. But she was gone now, taken by the Varian Empire. Or so he had believed. "Darien," a voice called out, snapping him from his thoughts. It was one of the village elders, an old man with a long beard and tired eyes. "It's time." Darien nodded, his jaw clenched. The Varian army would be upon them soon. They had little time to prepare, and even less hope of survival. He followed the elder back to the village, where the others were gathered. The warriors, the farmers, the healers, every able-bodied person was preparing for the fight of their lives. Darien moved through the crowd, offering words of encouragement where he could, but his mind was elsewhere, locked on a single thought: could they truly hold off the Empire's forces? As he approached the edge of the village, he saw the young men sharpening their blades, their faces pale but determined. Among them was Roderick, barely 18, his hands shaking as he gripped the hilt of his sword. Darien placed a hand on his shoulder. "Steady, lad," he said softly. "Fear is natural. But let it guide your blade, not weaken it." Roderick nodded, though his fear was still palpable. Darien looked out over the horizon. There was no sign of the Varian army yet, but he knew they were coming. His stomach twisted with a mixture of dread and anticipation. It wasn't just the battle that weighed on him. It was the thought of what lay beyond it, the impossible choice he knew he would have to make. The hours passed slowly, the village shrouded in a tense silence as they waited for the inevitable. Darien kept himself busy, helping with the fortifications and going over battle plans with the other warriors. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the image of Elara from his mind. she had been the village's most skilled healer, the one everyone turned to in times of need. She and Darien had shared dreams of a future beyond the wars, a life of peace. But that dream had been shattered when the Virian army had taken her. At least, that's what Darien had believed. Until tonight, the news had come just hours ago from one of their scouts. The Virian army was being led by a new general, a figure known only as the Blade. And that general was none other than Elara. Darien's heart had nearly stopped when he heard the name. Elara, the woman he had loved, the woman he had thought dead or imprisoned, was now leading the enemy forces. He couldn't comprehend it. It was as if everything he knew, everything he had believed, had been turned upside down in an instant. How could she? How could she betray their home, their people? The question gnawed at him as he sat in his tent, staring at the flickering light of a lone candle. His mind raced with memories of her, her laughter, her touch, the way her eyes had sparkled when they talked about their future. Had it all been a lie? No, he couldn't believe that. There had to be a reason. There had to be some explanation for why she had turned against them. And yet, the bitter truth was unavoidable. Tomorrow, they would face each other on the battlefield. Darien didn't sleep that night. He spent the hours pacing, his heart heavy with the weight of his oath. By dawn, the Virian army had arrived, their banners flying high as they approached the village. The villagers were ready, or as ready as they could be. Darien stood at the front of the line, his sword drawn, his eyes scanning the approaching army. And there, at the head of the Virian forces, he saw her, Elara. She was clad in armor, her once soft features now hardened with the weight of command. Her eyes, which had once looked at him with love, were cold, unreadable. For a moment, their gazes locked. Time seemed to slow, the world fading away until it was just the two of them. Darien felt a surge of emotion, love, anger, confusion, all warring inside him. But he couldn't afford to hesitate. With a shout, the battle began. The clash of steel filled the air as the villagers fought desperately to defend their home. Darien was in the thick of it, his sword cutting through Virian soldiers with precision and fury. But his mind was elsewhere, consumed by the knowledge that Elara was out there, fighting for the enemy. He fought his way through the chaos, his eyes searching for her. Finally, he found her, standing over the body of a fallen villager, her sword raised. Elara, he shouted, his voice carrying over the din of battle. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, without a word, she raised her sword and charged. Darien barely had time to react. Their swords clashed, the sound ringing in his ears as they fought. Each strike was filled with emotion, anger, betrayal, love. It was as if the battle between them was not just physical, but a reflection of the war inside their hearts. Elara, Darien panted, his voice strained. Why? Why are you doing this? She didn't answer, her face set in a grim mask of determination. Their blades met again and again, each strike more desperate than the last. I had no choice, she finally said, her voice cold. The village is doomed, Darien. The Empire will crush us all. I chose survival. You betrayed us, Darien spat, his heart breaking with every word. You betrayed me. Elara hesitated for a moment, her sword wavering. For the first time, Darien saw a flicker of something in her eyes, regret, perhaps, or doubt. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. I did what I had to, she said, her voice hard once more. Darien's grip tightened on his sword. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, but deep down, he knew what he had to do. He had sworn an oath to protect his people, to defend his home. And that oath bound him, just as surely as the red moon bound the sky. With a final, desperate cry, Darien struck. His blade found its mark, and Alara's sword fell from her hand. She crumpled to the ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, Darien stood frozen, his heart shattering as he looked down at her. He had won. But at what cost? Alara's eyes fluttered open, and for the briefest of moments, she smiled, a sad, broken smile. "You always were the better fighter," she whispered. Tears blurred Darien's vision as he knelt beside her. He reached out, taking her hand in his heart heavy with sorrow. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Alara's smile faded, and her eyes closed for the last time as the red moon sank below the horizon. Darien stood alone on the battlefield, his heart heavy with the weight of his oath. He had done what he had sworn to do. He had defended his home, just as the gods had witnessed. But in doing so, he had lost the one thing he had loved most. The village had survived, but Darien knew that he would carry the scars of this night for the rest of his life. The gods had heard his oath, and they had held him to it. But the price had been high. With the dawn came the promise of a new day. But for Darien, the red moon would never truly set. Darien stood amidst the battlefield, the cool morning air still heavy with the scent of blood and smoke. The light of the red moon had faded, leaving behind only the pale glow of dawn creeping over the horizon. Around him, the survivors began to move, gathering the dead and tending to the wounded. The village had won, but the cost weighed heavily on every soul. He stared down at Alara's lifeless body, her pale skin as cold as the earth beneath her. He knelt beside her, his hand gently brushing a lock of her hair from her face. He had known her for so long, loved her for even longer, and now she was gone. Killed by his own hand. The gods may have witnessed his oath, but they offered no solace for the pain now tearing at his heart. For a brief moment, the world around him disappeared. The sounds of the villagers working to clear the battlefield faded to a distant hum. All he could hear was the silence between them, Darien and Alara, as if the entire world held its breath in recognition of what had been lost. "Darien." The voice was soft, but it broke the silence like a thunderclap. He turned to see one of the village elders, a man with a weathered face and kind eyes, standing a few paces away. His name was Joran, one of the wisest men in the village, someone Darien had often sought counsel from in his younger days. "We must prepare," Joran said, his voice gentle but firm. "There is still work to be done." Darien blinked, his thoughts struggling to return to the present. The battle was over, but the fight to protect their home was not. The Empire of Varian would not give up so easily. This was but one victory in a much larger war. They had to be ready for the next attack, and the one after that. "I know," Darien replied, his voice hollow. He stood, looking down at Alara one last time before turning away. "I'll help with the preparations." The village was in shambles, its once peaceful streets now littered with the debris of battle. Darien walked through the remains, helping where he could. His body moved automatically, his mind still wrestling with the memory of Alara. How could someone who had once been so full of life and love have chosen a path so dark? He wanted to believe there had been more to her choice, something he had missed, but the truth was too clear. She had made her decision, and so had he. As the day wore on, the village slowly began to recover. The dead were buried, their graves marked with simple stones. The wounded were treated, though many would carry the scars of this battle for the rest of their lives. The villagers moved with a sense of purpose, their determination growing stronger in the wake of their victory. They knew the Empire would return, but for now, they had bought themselves a little more time. Darien found himself at the edge of the village, staring out over the horizon where the Varian army had come from. The land stretched out before him, wide and open, with no sign of the enemy. But he knew they were out there, gathering their forces, preparing for another attack. That he clenched his fists, the weight of his oath pressing down on him like never before. He had sworn to protect his people, and he had done that today. But the cost of keeping that oath had been far greater than he had ever imagined. He had lost Alara, and with her, a part of himself. Darien, a voice called again, this time sharper, more insistent. It was Roderick, the young warrior he had spoken to before the battle. The boy's face was pale, but his eyes were filled with a new determination, one forged in the fires of battle. The elders are asking for you. They want to discuss what comes next. Darien nodded, though his heart wasn't in it. He knew what came next. More fighting. More bloodshed. More loss. But he couldn't walk away, not now. Not ever. His oath was his burden, and he would carry it until his dying breath. He followed Roderick to the village center, where the elders had gathered. Their faces were grim, but there was a fire in their eyes that hadn't been there before. They had tasted victory, and now they were determined to hold on to it. The Varians will return, Joran said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. We've won this battle, but they won't stop. We need to prepare, to strengthen our defenses. The others murmured in agreement, their heads nodding. They knew what was at stake. We'll need to send word to the other villages, another elder added. If we stand together, we might stand a chance. Darien listened in silence, his mind drifting once again. He could hear their words, but they felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else's world. His world had ended on the battlefield when Alara had fallen. Darien, Joran's voice cut through his thoughts once again, bringing him back to the present. We need your leadership. You're the one who led us to victory today, and we need you to do it again. Darien felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. He had fought, yes. He had killed. But he didn't feel like a leader. Not now. Not after what he had done. Still, he couldn't refuse them. He had sworn an oath, and no matter the cost, he would see it through. I'll do what needs to be done, he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Joran nodded, his expression softening. You've done more than enough, Darien. But we're in this together. You don't have to carry this burden alone. Darien wished he could believe that, but deep down, he knew the truth. His burden was his alone. No one else could understand the weight of the choices he had made, the lives he had taken. As the sun began to set, Darien found himself alone once more, standing at the edge of the village, looking out over the distant hills. The red moon had set, but its memory lingered in the back of his mind, a constant reminder of the oath he had sworn. The gods had witnessed his vow, and they had held him to it. But now, as the stars began to fill the sky, Darien wondered if the gods would ever release him from his burden. He sighed, his breath misting in the cool night air. The village would rebuild. The Varians would return. And he would fight again. It was the way of things, the unending cycle of war and peace, of love and loss. But as Darien stood there, staring out into the night, he couldn't help but wonder if there was a way to break that cycle. A way to find peace, not just for his people, but for himself. For now, though, there were no answers. Only silence, and the distant call of the wind.